Okay, so moving into the 14th century, what we're going to see are some economic trends that aren't as advantageous, particularly to the peasants in Europe, and continuing strife between the kings and the nobles, and this sort of battle over authority and the extent to which nobles and increasingly sort of merchants and burghers, those sort of townspeople, have a say in government. So, in terms of peasant life, we saw there were some significant changes in the 13th century. In particular, urbanization does offer increased opportunities for some peasants who are able to move to the cities. However, most peasants still have sort of a remarkably static sort of experience. So, the family is the basic economic unit, and that's really sort of the determining factor of how sort of successful a family is. So it's very much based on life cycle. If you have younger children, you're not going to be able to sort of maximize revenues. But if you have older children within the household who then are sort of contributing, then your position is going to be significantly better. You do see sort of this gender division of labor. Women tend to stay closer to the house, involved in sort of food preparation, also food production. A lot of the houses would have had sort of gardens attached, also tending to small children, or sort of spinning, maybe producing sort of a batch of ale on the side. So then the men would be more focused on sort of raising of the livestock, also engaged in agricultural labors, though clearly there would have been times of the year when that division was sort of less clear. So, for example, as you see in this depiction at harvest time, it was sort of all hands on deck. You would have everyone within the community sort of out there. And sort of in winter months, especially with inclement weather, the men would have been in the home, sort of repairing tools or working on sort of small projects. You do see in a lot of these families sort of multi-generational households at times, again, sort of depending on where they're at in the life cycle. So maybe grandparents. Typically, peasants married older in their early 20s because you couldn't get married until you'd established your own independent household, and you needed enough sort of economic income to do that. And so it wouldn't have been uncommon to have children late teens, early 20s, still living with their parents. So still very much centered on villages, manors. You do see this is sort of a challenging life. They work from sun up to sundown, though there would have been some relief. So feast days, especially sort of centered on the church, Christmas, obviously, but also Easter, Epiphany. And then there would have been celebrations, marriages, baptisms, and you would have also had the occasional sort of merchant moving through, selling goods that people couldn't produce themselves. So this is to give you an idea of what a typical peasant house looked like in terms of a residence. A lot of these houses are just sort of one-room houses. You may have had sort of a separate division between where the family lived and where you kept small livestock, chickens, pigs, things like that, as you see in this sort of drawing here. But these are pretty basic structures. You have that central hearth that you cook on and also provides warmth. No such thing as a chimney yet, so you just hope that the smoke sort of finds its way out. Most houses didn't have windows because again, to keep warmth inside, they don't have glass yet, so there's no way to really close those windows. Most people would have occupied the central part of the dwelling. Now, perhaps if you have older children, you're able to sort of build a loft area for them to sleep in. But otherwise, you probably had sort of one bed that everyone shared, maybe a chest to keep valuables or a change of clothes, a table, a bench that you could sort of move around. But these are some pretty sort of Spartan accommodations. As you can see from this reconstructed peasant house from the UK, the dwellings themselves were made out of what we call wattle and daub. So they would have been framed with timber, and then the actual sort of house itself, you would have had sort of a square that you framed, and then you weave together maybe some twigs, and then you covered that with this clay that is sort of very common to the UK. the clay would be set in the sun and it would be baked, and then it would harden, and then you sort of tie these different sort of squares, these frames together, and then you whitewash it all with a lime. So these are pretty cheap to make. You could put up a peasant house collectively if everyone pitched in a day. They probably were intended to last about one generation. They weren't sort of terribly durable structures, but they didn't need to be if you could sort of replace it every generation or so. So increasingly into the 14th century, the economic expansion that we see earlier not only stops, but it begins to contract. Peasants in particular really had to bear the burden of a lot of these military campaigns of Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III. So whenever the king needed to raise funds to pursue his war, Parliament would give him permission to levy taxes upon the peasants. And so these are sort of extra taxes in addition to everything else you pay. And so increasingly, peasants sort of paid the price of the wars without reaping any of the benefits. You also have a series of weather events. 1317 to 1318 is the most extreme. There's drought, which then results in famine. But even into the 1320s, then you have the opposite. You have a series of sort of torrential rains that last much longer than they should. The crops themselves sort of get moldy and decompose. And so the peasant population is really weakened from a sort of a nutritional standpoint early on in the 14th century, which makes them very vulnerable to disease when the plague hits mid-century. Until now, because population was increasing, they're clearing more land, they're cutting down forests, but they've kind of reached their limit in terms of where they can expand. And so they're really forced to sort of just deal with what they have, which is really not enough agricultural arable land to sustain the population. Mortality rates continue to be very high. You can see from these numbers. So 1/3 of all infants die before they reach their first birthday. And only 1/3 of all children survive past the age of 10. So particularly amongst the peasant class, their birth rates were much lower than the nobility. And their mortality rates are also much higher than the nobility. So contrary to what we often assume, most peasant families did not have a lot of children. So shifting gears a little bit to then look at some of this continued sort of conflict between kings and sort of the barons or the leading nobles of England that destabilize the government, but do ultimately sort of lead towards more parliament controlling government and more leading eventually to sort of a constitutional monarchy. So when Edward II is crowned, he faces a number of challenges that actually have nothing to do with him. So economic depression, as I just talked about, the treasury is completely empty because of all the wars of his father. Increasingly, too, what's happened, and this is one reason why in the late Middle Ages, some of these nobles are really, really powerful. Since the Norman conquest, the tradition is that kings, in order to secure the loyalty of vassals, alienate land. So you give land to your vassals, you give them titles and responsibilities, and this sort of secures that loyalty. But by the time we get to the 14th century, almost all that land has been granted. So not only does Edward not have additional land to draw upon to secure the support of vassals, but some of those vassals control vast amounts of territory, a lot of resources, and they're very wealthy. There is already concern about Edward's capabilities as a monarch when he comes to power. So there's a lot written about Edward III at the time. Not much of it is very flattering. History has been very, very critical of Edward. Probably some of it justly so, but some of it probably sort of hindsight. But we do know his relationship with his father was very rocky. They fell out on a number of occasions. He felt like his allowance wasn't sufficient, and he also tended to bond very closely with individuals who sometimes his father thought were not the best influence on him. And I'll talk about that in a second. He also just wasn't sort of the soldier that his father was. He tried at times to sort of continue the war against Scotland. He tried to continue the wars against France, but he just didn't really have the military acumen, and he wasn't super successful. And in part, as we'll see moving forward, the ability of a king to successfully lead his forces into battle becomes integral to his ability to command authority amongst the nobles. And that was just really a challenge for Edward, who you see sort of depicted here in a contemporary manuscript being crowned. So the nobles do agree to have him crowned, but they demand some concessions. They demand that he is going to consult with the community of the realm and that he's going to include them in governance. Right before Edward I dies, he arranges the marriage of Edward to Isabella of France. And you can see Isabella pictured here. She's right to the left of her father, Philip IV, the King of France, and then surrounded by her brothers, many of whom will eventually become king as well. And we'll talk more about Isabella moving forward. So initially then, Edward runs into some opposition from the nobles in response to his approach to governing. So one of these people that his father had considered a bad influence was a man named Piers Galveston. Piers Galveston was a knight from Brittany, sort of lower nobility, but he ends up in the household of Edward II when they're both like 14 and 15. And they become very, very close. And the King, Edward I, is not happy about Galveston's influence on Edward II. So he exiles him. One of the first things that Edward does once he becomes king is he recalls Galveston, and he actually makes him the Earl of Cornwall. And this is an illuminated letter C, that this is the grant, a picture of the grant, sort of conferring that very prestigious office, along with a lot of land and money on Galveston. And so increasingly then, not only does Edward sort of continue to shower favors and wealth on Galveston, but he allows Galveston really a sort of disproportionate say in governing. And so the nobles, especially sort of the inner circle of nobles, becomes very resentful of Galveston's wealth, but also not happy with the extent of his influence on government. Edward does attempt to continue to pursue his father's war against the Scots. However, he doesn't have any money. So in order to raise money, he needs to assemble Parliament, but he doesn't want to do that because he knows that Parliament's going to ask for concessions and perhaps sort of try to intervene in his relationship with Galveston. So he tries to find other ways to raise money. He owes something like £23,000 to an Italian banker. Eventually, sort of the debt's called in and he can't pay. So he's forced to then go to Parliament and ask for money. And as becomes increasingly common during this period, when Parliament is assembled and the king asks for money, they say, sure, we'll let you levy a tax, but first you need to make some concessions to us. And those concessions come in the form of the ordinances of 1311. So it's really another sort of instance in the tradition of Magna Carta, provisions of Oxford, when the English nobility is trying to limit the power of the king, but also expand their own role in governing. The leader of this opposition party is Thomas, Duke of Lancaster, who is Edward's cousin. And what they really want to do is they want to sort of build on the provisions of Oxford. And so they established a body of individuals, 21 nobles, who they call ordainers. These ordainers then get to consent on the appointment of any administrative offices like chancellor, chamberlain, head of the exchequer. They also get to approve any declarations of war. They claim veto power over any of Edward's household appointments, so to make sure that they have some say in who's really close to the king and might influence the king. They also demand approval over alienation of land. So if the king wants to grant land to anyone, like he did with Galveston, they have sort of the right to intervene. And they demand that Galveston be exiled. He just, in their opinion, has too much influence over the king, and so Galveston is sent to France. Although Edward initially agrees to these terms, as soon as he gets his money, and is in a position of strength. He allows Gaveston to return. Shortly after that, he revokes the ordinances. In part, that baronial opposition is still there, but there is some discord between leaders of that opposition. The Duke of Lancaster has some personality traits that sort of alienate a lot of people, and so he loses some support. However, as Edward tries to sort of strengthen his position, Gaveston falls into the hands of the Duke of Lancaster. The Duke of Lancaster then takes it upon himself to accuse Gaveston of treason. He has sort of a sham trial, and he executes Gaveston. This is the location. This is a later monument, like an 18th century monument that was erected in the place where Gaveston was executed. There is no love lost for Gaveston amongst these other nobles. They did not like him, but they also feel that Lancaster overstepped, that he did not have the authority to do what he did. And so many of them tried to sort of mend their relationship with the king. Edward II is able to use that to negotiate sort of a temporary truce. A lot of the barons who supported Lancaster, including Lancaster, are pardoned. And then in return, they agree to support Edward's war with Scotland and to give him money to raise an army. That is exactly what he does. In 1314, Edward then raises a really sizable army. He's got about 15 to 20,000 men. Increasingly, the position of Robert the Bruce in Scotland has strengthened to the extent that he's actually able to begin raiding parts of northern England. He lays siege to Stirling Castle. The garrison at Stirling Castle reaches out to Edward and asks for reinforcements, and so Edward invades. The two sides meet at the Battle of Bannockburn, which is pictured here. It's a pretty bloody battle, but mostly the losses are on the English side. Edward, as I said, is just not the military commander that his father was. He makes some decisions that obviously it's easy in hindsight, but that are just sort of odd. So for example, he is counseled not to attack immediately, but he does so anyway, even though the location is not favorable to his troops. He also, for some reason, leaves his archers at the back of his army when he attacks. They're not in position at all, so they have no effect on the outcome of the battle at all. And the English losses are just absolutely incredible. And so Edward is forced to flee. Isabella is also forced to flee. He kind of leaves her behind, and she's forced to try and find a ship and get to safety. And shortly after the Battle of Bannockburn, the castle at Stirling surrenders to the forces of Robert the Bruce. So the relationship between Edward and his nobles continues to disintegrate. They're very unhappy with what happened at Bannockburn. They don't feel that Edward is consulting them enough on decisions. You also have the pressure of this economic pressure of the famine in 1316, 1317. And then Gaveston is gone, but he's essentially just been replaced by an English noble named Hugh Despencer. And Hugh Despencer, much like Gaveston, becomes very, very close to the king. There are suggestions that their relationship is more than just platonic, but we just don't know from the sources. But we do know that Edward gives a lot of land and revenue and titles to Hugh Despencer. Hugh Despencer, much like Gaveston, is very arrogant, and he alienates a lot of the other nobles who call him the second king because of his influence on events. Eventually then, the Duke of Lancaster once again raises an army to challenge Edward and Hugh Despencer. The forces meet at the Battle of Boroughbridge, and in this instance, Edward's forces are victorious. They manage to capture Lancaster and execute him. And in this instance, Edward also is determined to sort of permanently punish a lot of the nobles who were involved. So he sets up these sort of sham courts across England where a lot of the barons who were involved in this revolt are tried. The outcome is predetermined. Many of them are executed. Their lands are confiscated and their families are fined. And so this is actually not only a way to eliminate opposition, but to raise funds. And so all of those confiscated lands go to Edward, the fines go into his treasury. And so after the execution of Lancaster, which you see pictured here, Edward believes himself to be in a much better position. However, he is wrong. Over the last few years, his relationship with Isabella, his wife, has deteriorated. She initially was a fairly staunch supporter. She was one of the people who did have sort of an active voice in governing. However, since Edward has become close to Hugh Despencer, that sort of role has diminished. Hugh Despencer does not want her actively involved in any governing. He tries to marginalize her. He is also concerned about her influence on their children, particularly their eldest son, Edward. And so he removes the children from her custody and he transfers them to the household of his sister. There is, I'm kind of trying to simplify some things, but Isabella's brother, Charles IV, is the King of France at this time. Edward and Charles are in a dispute over some territory. Charles says, "Send my sister and my nephew, young Prince Edward, to Paris for negotiations. If my nephew agrees to pay homage to me for this land, I will agree to recognize his right to it." There is some reluctance on Edward II's part to see Isabella and particularly Prince Edward go to France, but he agrees. He doesn't feel like he has any other options. This is an illustration of this moment when Prince Edward does pay homage to his uncle for that land. What Edward doesn't know, however, is that Isabel does not have any intention of returning until it's with an army. Oops. Edward then is forced to surrender. He's imprisoned here at Berkeley Castle. This is sort of a covered walkway into the tower where he's held captive. Parliament then initiates the process to formally depose him. And this is totally unprecedented. We've seen kings lose the throne before, but it's never been a legislative process. It's been through military conquest. And in this case, you actually have both. And that's going to create an important precedent moving forward. So Edward is declared incompetent and incapable of governing by Parliament. He agrees then to abdicate in favor of his son. So Edward III is formally crowned. He is only like 10 or 11 though. So Roger Mortimer and his mother Isabella assume the regency until he comes of age. Not everyone is supportive of what's happened. There are some royalists who support Edward II and believe he is still the rightful king. So there are rumors, talks of people attempting to free him from captivity. On the 21st of September, we don't know what happens, but we know that he dies. Reports say that he dies in his sleep, which is very unlikely. Most likely, the attempt was made. He was killed. His captors killed him because they knew that as long as he was alive, there would be this attempt to sort of liberate him, and Edward III would not be able to establish his authority. But this situation does not last very long. In 1330, Edward III declares his independence. By now, he's close to the age of majority. He's been increasingly frustrated at the way Mortimer and his mother have sort of marginalized him from government. He also doesn't like their open sexual relationship. He also doesn't like what he believes to have been Mortimer's role in the death of his father. And so he has Mortimer seized, tried by Parliament, and eventually executed. And then he himself removes his mother from power. So she's sort of sent to her dower lands and given an allowance. The next sort of logical step for Edward is to restore royal authority across England, which he will do in part through by pursuing war against France. The bigger sort of implication here is this is the first time we see a king of England who has an undisputable claim to the throne be removed. And it's removed on the grounds of incompetence, his inability to rule. Not only is this going to increase the power of the nobility within England, but it's going to set an important precedent. And then we're going to see, at least on 2 more occasions moving forward, a repeat of this sort of internal conflict, which results in the deposition of a king. So a lot of instability in late medieval England moving forward.